Welcome, everybody. It is Business Monday. It is the 3:30 version of the 4 o'clock hour with the money man, Gary Sasse. He knows all. He owns all. And he's got some big insights. This past week, the Commissioner of Education, along with Ernst & Young, the global consulting company, used to be an accounting firm back in the day, but now it's a global consulting firm, came out with a report, $295,000 report that outlined what the condition of the Providence school system finances are, where the money is being spent, how it's being spent, and whether or not there's enough money to take the system to the next level. You have some significant insights into this. Walk us through it.
Well, yeah, before I get into those insights, I think the study was very valuable. I think it, gave a good environmental scan of the finances of the city. I was delighted to see that the projected deficits are nowhere near what people thought, which is helpful. I thought they hit it right on the money by saying that the funds were not being used where the kids needed the funds, and that there were certain areas that we needed to be more flexible and reallocate money. So it was a very helpful study. But one aspect of the study that I thought was quite interesting was there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about how we fund the schools. And that's really the elephant in the room. When you look at a funding issue with public education, whether it's in Rhode Island or in California, you have to look at both what the locals are raising and what the state is raising. And when you examine how the funding formula is working, I think you can say that Providence, that equity is not being achieved as the architects of the formula thought it would be achieved. And the starting point is Providence is probably being underfunded by the state in the range of $6 to $12 million.
So functionally, the state's obligation under the formula, coupled with the city's match, is underfunded right now between $6 and $12 million, depending on some of the subsets, number of English learning students, number of special education students, etc.
Let me try to explain, and it's complicated, so I apologize, but I don't know how else to do it. And I think you were very...
You're a wonk. You're the perfect person to explain it.
I'll put it in English. And you were very wise to point out that the equity issue is a combination of both local and state funds, not just a state formula. But think of the state formula in two big pots. And the first pot we'll call the core instruction pot, or the foundation amount, which deals with what you pay for materials, for teachers, for general administration of the school. It's an amount of money that the state says you need to fund a basic education program. And money for the core instructional amount comes from what your state share would be, which is based on an equalized basis, and then the local match for that state share. So that's your foundation amount.
Right.
So that's part one. Okay. Part two is what are called categorical programs. And the categorical programs are no different than categorical programs we talk about when you talk about federal categorical aid or state categorical aid. But they deal with a lot of programs that are very important to the kind of population of kids that we have in poor urban districts. They deal with early childhood. They deal with high-cost special ed kids. They deal with English learning language students. They deal with debt service and things like that. And those are categorical aid. So the amount of money that you get from the state is a sum of the core instructional amount, which are described, plus the categorical aid. And when you do that, you find out that there are certain tweaks or twitches in the formula which result, as I said, in equalization not being achieved. And equalization is not being achieved in the urban areas primarily. And the three big losers are Woonsocket, Pawtucket, and Providence, what you would expect. Central Falls is not, because the state
already runs that system. Those are the four worst performing educational systems in the state.
And so you start to look at some of the reasons why. Well, one reason is that the core instructional amount is not sufficient to fund the basic education program in Providence, is because the relationship between categorical funding and general formula funding. It's not sufficient because a lot of times the city did not come up with the amount of money it should have come up with to match the federal money. Now, the reason the city doesn't come
The
up with...
federal money or the state
I'm
money?
sorry, the state money. Yeah, I'm always thinking the feds, but the state money, and there are a lot of nuances behind that. One nuance is obviously we have a declining commercial tax base, and so there's tax pressure. Very hard to go to and increase taxes. We have a lot of legacy costs built in. Not just to the schools, but to the...
Should the state have been forcing the city, though, to fully fund those aspects under the formula?
Well, that's a very good question.
Or were they not motivated to force the municipalities because they would then have to come up with the corresponding match?
No, the state put the match up first. Some of these cities weren't capable of doing it. We had a conference out at Bryan, Hasseville Institute. We're going to have another one in January where we brought together the six or seven poor school districts in the state, and we're developing with them an agenda to deal with the education issues in the poorer communities. And the poorer communities are defined by those that have more than 50% of their kids in the proxy for poverty. And so it's a very tough issue. If the state had mandated that, it's almost like getting water out of a turnip, because you mandate that the communities come up with the money. Well, how do you get the money in one socket?
Right.
How do you get, what do you do about commercial tax-based problems here? What do you do about built-in legacy costs where property tax money is being used to fund benefit programs that were agreed to 10 and 15 years ago? So it's complicated. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Senator Ryan Pearson, who has identified a number of these problems, and there's a legislative commission in the Senate group, working on the issues.
Absolutely.
So we have to answer the question you just answered of how or when do you mandate that the communities come up with a certain amount of money to meet the foundation amount. You have to decide how you want to handle the categoricals. I think, and I just as a supposition right now, I need more research, that if you took these categorical programs, for example, English learners, high-cost special ed, and some of the career and tech programs, and you funded them, and you said they were part of the foundation program, because sure as heck, they are part of the core instructional program. We can define them as categorical because they're very expensive, but they really are part of the core program. So we need to go back in and figure out what the proper balance is between the general formula and categorical funding.
Let me just, I don't want to leave that for 1 second. The number of vacancies in, I believe it was both on English learners and on special education, I think we're 25% of the faculty positions are vacant right now in the Providence school system. And those populations are the growing populations. So not only are they potentially underfunded, but they're at a cataclysmic level of being, with the lack of staffing that's going on. That was one of the findings of the Ernst & Young's.
Yeah, no, I think it was, I forget, I'll have the numbers backwards, but I think it was 25% of special ed and 40% of language, or vice versa. And one of the things that I would be very interested in learning, which you don't know, is how that number relates to other places. Mm-hmm. Because I am aware of the fact that we have not just us, but all over the country, there's difficulty in recruiting teachers that teach for special ed or teach English language learners. So while that's a very high number, how different is that number from what the
Listen, I was on the city council in 1991 to 1995. The vacancy level of bilingual special education teachers, which was under huge demand, is a nationwide problem. There simply aren't enough, and there is tremendous pressure on trying to recruit them and retain them, and their compensation level is almost limitless.
Well, and I think if you look, from my opinion, at the tagline for that entire report, the report is that we're not funding where the needs of kids are. There's nothing more basic than that.
There were a couple of horrible factoids, too. Providence's cost to transport students on an apples-to-apples level was 3 times the cost of Cranston. How can that even happen? No one's being held accountable for this. No one, anywhere. Well, was that the school committee? Was that the administration in Providence? Was that, is that just Providence corruption and incompetence? How do you sign a transportation contract which you can easily find out what your neighboring city is paying for?
Well, a lot of that goes back to labor relations. If you sign a contract with X company and you decide X company is not performing and you fire X company and they're unionized workers, how do you manage that situation? These issues that were identified, one thing about the report, I don't think anything in the report really surprised anybody very, very much, but now what would be tremendously useful, and I think we have to restore a sense of urgency in how we deal with the Providence problems. One place I would start would be to take this report, because there's some really seminal findings in it, and they're not little stuff buried in the mud somewhere. They're big things.
Yep.
And I would put out my plan of how we're going to start funding programs where the kids are. I would put out a program of how we're going to reduce janitorial custodial costs, if I can, by X%, so they're more comparative with the Cranston or other similar communities. I would talk about what school buildings are we closed. Buildings in terrible shape. We're not going to be able to fix all of them. We know that there are certain demographic trends. Can we close some of the bad buildings down and that we can't afford to fix? I'd like to see that plan. I'd like to see the city or the school committee, particularly the commissioner, come up with her plan to deal with fixing the formula. They're not big fixes. No one's talking about blowing up the formula, but there's some significant inequities in that formula as it affects the Woonsockets and the Pawtuckets and the Providences. And if we're going to have an urban strategy on education, that has to be dealt with. So these items, in the report, we've known about. The report did a good job, I think, in documenting them and explaining them and bringing them to public light. So what? The next step.
That's right.
The next,
How many more studies do we need?
This was helpful. That I think this set a good baseline benchmark for going forward. So now we got the benchmark baseline, and who's going to play with it? Who's going to deal with this? What we found out from this benchmark, and tell the parents more and the kids in the city of how we're going to improve this and how we measure progress to get to the promised land.
Are we underestimating the cost of new building construction? Fall River is building a new high school. It's coming in, I think, at $270 million. Both the Blue Ribbon report of 3 or 4 years ago done by the state has replacement costs for things like Central High School at around $100 million. That seems wildly underestimating the cost when you're looking at construction costs north of $100 a square foot.
I don't know the answer to that question. I do believe that RIDE is doing a better job working with the districts and more realistic in their appraisals now than they were 5 or 7 or 10 years ago. But I'm not sure you can fix this thing without creating a school building authority. Both in terms of creative financing and doing and focusing like a laser and answering the questions that you just raised on staying on top of course, staying on top of where the economies and savings are. And I'm not, I know RIDE's people are very professional, and I'm not criticizing them, but I think they work at a disadvantage by not having a school building authority that's a kind of a quasi-independent agency or a joint state.
And we have billions of dollars, no two ways about it. Across the strait, we have billions of dollars of rehab costs and new construction needs that need to be addressed to be able to be even vaguely competitive.
A great example, a couple of years ago, and correct me if my figures are wrong, people approved a $250 million bond issue to fix schools. Well, when you sit down and you say, well, how many schools do you fix?
1, 2.
Or is it for
new
maintenance?
schools?
Is it for maintenance? Is it for new construction? And that's the kind of thing that if you have an authority that's quasi-independent, you get rules established real quickly on what we need to do for maintenance and what allocations we need to make for maintenance, how we finance the maintenance allocations, versus the cost of building new middle, high schools.
Are we also building schools for a time gone by? We're safe, warm, dry. I can't remember the term of art that the governor used all the time. We need smart schools. I mean, you go to a prep school and you look at what the technology infrastructure that they're building. You go to Worcester, you look at the technology infrastructure that they're putting in public schools in Worcester, and we're talking about fixing roofs.
Well, well, first of all, if the roof's leaking, you got to fix it. And the safe, warm thing is basic. But
safe, warm, dry, safe.
But you raise another question. Let's say we build schools that were, technically state of the art, and I think the private sector has to do more to do that. We've spoken about that before. Let's say you build schools that are state of the art. Who are you going to tax to raise the money to fund those? Because when this report came out, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, you and I both, that, boy, they were just projecting a very manageable deficit, $3 to $5 million. On a $370 million, if you projected a $3 to $5 million deficit, that's a bookkeeping error.
Yep.
That's not a problem. People have thought the deficits were in the $20 to $25 million range, and all our politicians breathed a sigh of relief. They said, thank you. We don't. It's not a problem of money. Well, it's not a problem of money, but you can't.
Well, it's not a problem of money if you want the same crappy outcomes that you've got now.
But that's the point. What kind of political leadership do we have in the state if the reaction is, boy, the deficit's not as bad as we thought, and it's not a problem of money?
We can continue to fund the worst educational system, arguably, in the United States. Let's go to that. Go ahead.
I just want you to think, because I don't want to put it in context. So, from my reading of the report, which is not detailed, but my reading is that they found about $19 to $20 million that we could use more flexibly to meet some of the needs. Well, if we could do that, but that's 19 or 20 million on a $360 million base. To do the things that you want to do is going to require additional investment, which is going to require additional state spending or additional property taxes. And our politicians breathe a sigh of relief and say, boy,
are we wasting a good crisis? In other words, we have 2 years of RICAS. We have the Johns Hopkins report. We have the Ernst & Young report. We have humiliation at the national level by the Wall Street Journal, not once but twice. And there seems to be 0.0% urgency. We have no superintendent in Providence. We have a school committee that's still acting, which no one clearly understands what its role is. No one has been fired. Not one person has been fired. Not one person significantly in a role of reform has been hired. We're now into it in months and months. At what point should we get cynical about the usual Rhode Island approach to dealing with a crisis?
Well, I'm not there yet. I'm not saying that.
When will you be there? I ask you about every month.
Yeah, we always get to a
They're
point.
getting close on hiring a superintendent?
Well, yeah, I'm getting close to being so fastballs again. I can't. But you don't want to make those kinds of judges prematurely because we have a new commissioner who's working hard.
At what point are you no longer a new commissioner? How many years into the job?
First paycheck, usually.
Okay, so she's not a new commissioner anymore.
First paycheck.
She will be a 1 year in 3 months, I think. A 1 year commissioner.
I can't. With the questions, I'm joking with you, but I don't know the answer to that question. I think we'd all like to see what the per chart is, and so so you can answer that question. If I knew what the targets were to get things done,
would Mr. and Mrs. Sasse be patient? You have 3 children.
No, we have.
How many children?
We have 4 children.
You have 4 children. All went on to academic achievement.
Quite a bit.
Would you allow your 4 children to stay in Providence schools while they do another assessment, another analysis, another?
When we live out in the suburbs, and when
the answer to that question is no.
And when we moved, no, there's a personal part of the story too. When we moved to Rhode Island, we found out from Tennessee. We found out that our kids, the curriculum was more advanced in Tennessee, and we wanted to keep the kids in public school, but we were not able to do that because they had been repeating what they'd done in Tennessee, so they went to private school.
Okay, so you answered my question.
That's it, yeah.
Let's jump over in our last 5 minutes over to the state budget. We're starting to see some claims out of the governor's office about what the direction she's going on. Wants to, I think, end the repeal of the car tax, I think, has been an utterance. She's looking at new fees. She's looking at other taxes. What's your thoughts?
Well, we have $180 million deficit next year. This year's pretty good. This year, it's
break even.
It's $4 million deficit. A year ago at this time, the annual deficit was $42 million. So this year we're fine. Next year, $180 million. When you look at the budget, you first ask what's driving this. And there are 2 things driving it. There are education costs and the costs for Medicaid, Health and Human Services.
I'm going to add one more, poor budgeting. We've lost $40 million in 2 years on, quote, sports betting that was supposed to
Well,
be realized.
but
That's $40 million that was budgeted in new revenue.
Yeah, but when you look at this year's revenue, and you got to be careful when you look at one single source. I said we're breaking even this year because our income tax has done better, our sales tax has done better, our gambling has done a lot worse. Not just sports betting, but
Right.
other aspects of gambling have done worse. Corporate tax is doing worse. We got a one-time boost in the inheritance tax. It's almost producing double what we thought. So I don't know what the estate was that was settled. But I remember stories when Governor Roberts, 30 or 40 years ago, was in there. There was one estate they were waiting to settle so they could balance the state budget. But so we've had, it's been mixed. Yeah, that's a net figure. But on the other hand, they've been positive figures. But we become over dependent upon gambling, and now we're facing the realities of competition. And it's not going to come back to where it was. But the problem we have is the driver side. Medicaid costs, and the governor's done things to reduce Medicaid costs. We spoke about education for the last 15 minutes. No one's going to be proposing reducing the rate of growth in state spending for education.
Right.
Debt service has been climbing pretty quickly. So that's 80% of the budget. When you look at education, health and human services, and debt services, that's 80 cents of every dollar the state spends. If you can't go in there, and this waste, fraud, and abuse is a lot of BS, if you can't go in there and start making programmatic changes to make significant savings, and you have a $180 million deficit, what options do you have? You either have to cut back on services or, think of the T word.
And do you think her approach of T word here and T word there and fee word here and fee word there is the right strategy?
Well, I think that there have been opportunities that have been lost. We've increased some taxes and some fees, and we've nickel and dimed everybody when we really needed to do what Kacheri did. When in 2008 and 9, we sat down and we developed a tax strategy, a strategic tax plan, which was implemented. It was a decade ago, and the governor should be doing that right now to adjust the revenue system to meet the spending needs, and that's what we're not doing.
Gary Sasse, the money man, we know you have to be out of the house at 4 o'clock. You are a gentleman and a scholar, and thanks for identifying those issues related to the Providence school system. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Check on GoLocal, a number of updates this afternoon on a range of things. The saddest news is Will Bundy passed away, professor at the Naval War College, former director at DOT.
Yeah, I was the co-chairman of the Alma transition team, and Bundy was the person that we had recommended to be the head of DOT.
Yeah.
He's a real gentleman, a good guy.
Yeah, absolutely. A total class act and kind of bigger than life kind of man. Just sort of.
He was big.
He was a big man, but he just kind of, when he walked in a room, he had a big, deep voice and kind of took control of things, and a very, very decent man. So our sympathies to his family. Tomorrow, Kate Nagel. Hopefully we've got Jennifer Lawless tuning in. She's always got something to say, and if she's not on with us, she's getting quoted in the Washington Post or the New York Times or Politico. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.